From the time this nation was founded, women have raised questions about their rights in a free society. Abigail Adams, writing to her husband John in Philadelphia, where he was helping to frame the new laws of the country.
In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants, if they could. If particular care is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion.
For a time, in the early years of the country, there was a kind of equality as men and women were partners, enduring the rigors of frontier life. But as towns and cities grew, men held to an age-old viewpoint. What one college teacher wrote in 1835 characterized attitudes throughout the 19th and into the 20th century.
The greater physical strength of man enables him to plunge into the turmoil and bustle of an active, selfish world. Courage and boldness are his attributes. He is the shield of woman, destined by nature to guard and protect her. Timidity and modesty are her attributes. She must rely upon the strength of others. Man must be engaged in her cause. How is he to be drawn over to her side? By the exhibition of those qualities which delight and fascinate, which are calculated to win over to her side the proud lord of creation, and to make him an humble suppliant at her shrine. Woman we behold dependent and weak, but out of that very weakness and dependence springs an irresistible power.
Writing, but almost never speaking in public, women opposed such views. How monstrous is the doctrine that woman is to be dependent on man. Where in all the sacred scriptures is this taught? But alas, she has too well learned the lesson which he has labored to teach her. She has surrendered her dearest rights and been satisfied with the privileges which man has assumed to grant her. He has adorned the creature whom God gave him as a companion with baubles and gewgaws. He has turned her attention to personal attractions. He has made her the instrument of his selfish gratification, a plaything to please his eye and amuse his hours of leisure. By flattery, by an appeal to her passions, he seeks access to her heart, and when he has gained her affections, he uses her as the instrument of his pleasure. He furnishes himself with a housekeeper, whose chief business is in the kitchen or the nursery, whilst he goes abroad and enjoys the means of improvement afforded by the collision of intellect with cultivated minds. At the close of the 18th century, an American feminist pointed out why males were held to be mentally superior. From what source does this superiority proceed? May we not trace its source in the difference of education and continued advantages? The one is taught to aspire. The other is early confined and limited. As their years increase, The sister must be wholly domesticated, while the brother is led by the hand through all the flowery paths of science. Could education be the means of achieving equality? Some early feminists thought so. But standing in the way were old world attitudes.
The whole education of women ought to be relative to men, to please them, to be useful to them, to make themselves loved and honored by them, to educate them when young, to care for them when grown, to counsel them, to console them, and to make life sweet and agreeable to them. These are the duties of women at all times, and what should be taught them from their infancy.
Find that her charms cannot have much effect on her husband's heart when they are seen every day, when the summer is past and gone. Will she then have sufficient native energy to look into herself for comfort and cultivate her dormant faculties? When the husband ceases to be a lover, and the time will inevitably come, her desire of pleasing will then grow languid or become a spring of bitterness, and love, perhaps the most evanescent of all passions, gives place to vanity or jealousy. Love, from its very nature, must be transitory. In the early 19th century, women accepted their sphere, the home. Few thought about equality or of education as a means of achieving it. But in the 1840s and 50s, a woman's movement was born. Out of another struggle for human rights, a woman tells of her awakening to the injustice of slavery. I was sitting in my chamber, weeping over the miseries of the slave, and putting up my prayers for his deliverance from bondage, when, in the midst of my meditations, it occurred to me that my tears, unaided by effort, could never melt the chain of the slave. I must be up and doing. The effort of one woman to dramatize the tragedy of slavery had an extraordinary impact upon the course of American history. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin brought home to great masses of people the cruelty and inhumanity of slavery as never before. No American novel ever had such far-reaching effect. The abolitionist movement drew women to meetings, but the first feminist leaders had to fight for the right to speak in public. Calling for Negro freedom, they began to see that they too would have to embark upon a crusade for the freedom of women. I feel that we have been with the Negro, that the iron has entered into our souls. True, we have not felt the slaveholder's lash, but our hearts have been crushed. I want to be identified with the Negro. Until he gets his rights, we never shall have ours.
Let my people go.
From 1848 onward, dedicated women came together to define goals and to advance their newborn cause. They were ridiculed by the press, and the church sounded a warning.
We invite your attention to the dangers which at present seem to threaten the female character with widespread and permanent injury. The power of woman is her dependence, flowing from the consciousness of that weakness which God has given her for her protection. When she assumes the place and tone of man as a public reformer, she yields the power which God has given her, and her character becomes unnatural.
The budding women's movement sought many changes. In clothing, for example. I wish that women, instead of being walking showcases, instead of begging of their fathers and brothers the latest and gayest new bonnet, would ask of them their rights. Some thought that changes in dress would allow women to live and work like men, and that this would be the key to equality. But the bloomer costume only brought ridicule and was seen as something of a mistake. We put the dress on for greater freedom, but what is physical freedom compared with mental bondage? It is not wise to use up so much energy that way. You can put them to greater use. I speak from experience. Practically, the present styles of dress, so far as convenience is concerned, are simply absurd. From the health point of view, they are suicidal. As years went on, it was to get worse. Editorial in the New York Herald, 1850.
What do the leaders of the Women's Rights Convention want? They want to vote and hustle with the rowdies at the polls. They want to be members of Congress and in the heat of debate subject themselves to coarse jests and indecent language. They want to fill all other posts which men are ambitious to occupy, to be lawyers, doctors, captains of vessels, and generals in the field. How did woman first become subject to man as she now is all over the world? By her nature, her sex, just as the Negro is and always will be to the end of time inferior to the white race, and therefore doomed to subjection. But happier than she would be in any other condition, just because it is the law of her nature.
Black women showed great courage in their struggle for freedom. Former slaves Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, inspiring figures in the abolitionist cause. In the still new cause of feminism, an outgrowth of abolitionism, leaders Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucy Stone spoke out on a wide variety of subjects. Advertising, how it degraded women. What mean these advertisements in our public prints, these family guides, these female medicines? Do not all these things show to what a depth of degradation the women have fallen, how false they have been to the instincts of their nature? Marriage, how it made women economically dependent. The present condition of woman causes a horrible perversion of the marriage relation. It is asked of a lady, has she married well? Oh, yes, her husband is rich. Woman must marry for a home. Work, how women were exploited. Women working in tailor shops are paid 1/3 as much as men. Someone in Philadelphia has stated that women make fine shirts for 12.5 cents apiece, that no woman can make more than 9 a week, and the sum thus earned after deducting rent, fuel, etc., leaves her just 3.5 cents a day for bread. Is it a wonder that women are driven to prostitution? The widening of woman's sphere is to improve her lot. Let us do it. And if the world scoff, let it scoff. If it sneer, let it sneer. But we will go on. After 2 decades of feminist activity, the new movement was interrupted by the onset of the Civil War. Large numbers of women took over men's work on farms and in business. Some cared for the wounded. They had left the sphere of home where they were said to belong. There was little male opposition. The war brought emancipation to the black man. But what did women gain, white or black? If the 2 millions of Southern black women are not to be secured in their rights of person, property, wages, and children, their emancipation is but another form of slavery. We demand that in changing the status of the 4 millions of Africans, the women, as well as the men, shall be secured in all the rights, privileges, and immunities of citizens. Such demands were not met. But there was slow progress toward an earlier objective. greater educational opportunity. Seminaries and colleges accepted larger numbers of women students. More women became teachers. A very few began to find their way into other professions. In the field of medicine, resistance was particularly strong. 1870 news account of something highly unusual: women in medical school.
The study of medicine is not unmingled pleasure, and the dissecting room is no bed of roses. More especially is medicine disgusting to women, accustomed to softnesses and the downy sides of life. They are sedulously screened from the observation of the horrors and disgusts of life. There is, however, no flowery path to medicine. Disgust and horrors open with the first page of Gray's Anatomy and thicken and become doubly distilled with every advancing step. Time will show the judgment, capacity for fatigue and strain of mind and nerve on which the success of women will depend.
Many women defended the home and attacked feminism.
All women of intelligence now understand that good cooking is a liberal science, and that there is a most intimate connection between food and virtue, and food and health, and food and thought.
The defenders of the home failed to recognize what was actually happening since the Civil War to increasing numbers of women. Now that through the invention of machinery, there has come a great revolution in the world of economics, so that wherever a man may go to earn an honest dollar, a woman may go also, there is no escape from the conclusion that she must be clothed with equal power to protect herself. That power is the ballot, the symbol of freedom and equality. So said Susan B. Anthony, foremost agitator for woman suffrage in America. Winning the vote was the specific goal in the latter decades of the 19th century and well into the 20th. Toward this one objective, women would bend all their efforts in the hope of reaching equality with men. There would be opposition all along the way.
Extend now to women suffrage and eligibility. Give them the political right to vote and be voted for. Render it feasible for them to enter the arena of political strife, to become canvassers in elections and candidates for office. And what remains of family union will soon be dissolved.
There was early proof that nothing of the sort would happen. In the 1870s, there were several instances in Wyoming, Utah, and in Boston where women won the right to vote in local elections. The voting caused no catastrophe.
I saw ladies, attended by their husbands, brothers, or sweethearts, pass through an open space to the polls, depositing their votes with no more exposure to insult or injury than they would expect on visiting a grocery store or meat market.
The suffrage argument made slow headway. As before, women's rights was always a subject for humor, occasionally at the expense of the male. The suffrage movement needed to be a mass movement. It had won adherents among the educated, but it needed women of all classes. For the most part, the handsome ladies are well satisfied with their personal lot, but they want the vote as a matter of justice, while the fluttering, jammed-in subway girls are terribly blind to the whole question of class oppression and of sex oppression. We must be rid of mere ladylikeness. We must succeed in making the oppressed class of women the most urgent in the demand for what we all must have. When we have brought this about, we women shall be irresistibly strong. what was lacking was organization. Examples from the past were few. Occasionally, women had gone on strike in a brief, brave show of strength. But labor unions had found women to be reluctant joiners. Young women, particularly, believed their jobs were just a prelude to marriage. Often they would find themselves back at work in a struggle for two instead of one. A problem that had moved women to organize, the spread of alcoholism and its effect on many families. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, often ridiculed by the press, greatly opposed by liquor interests, was an important experience, educating women to join together to win their demands. The drive for the vote was to take far longer than its leaders calculated. Male resistance was expected, but not the apathy from so many of their own sex. Speaking to women in the slums, Jane Addams saw that women needed a broader social concern. Woman must extend her sense of responsibility to many things outside of her own home if she would continue to preserve the home in its entirety. If the garbage is not properly collected and destroyed, a tenement house mother may see her children sicken and die of diseases from which she alone is powerless to shield them. Woman will have to have some conscience in regard to public affairs lying quite outside of her immediate household. The individual conscience and devotion are no longer effective. The woman alone was helpless, even to care for her own family. But organized with others, she had strength such as she had never known before. Leaders were now skillful, having learned what was effective. Militancy to energize the cause, organization to keep the movement strong and growing. 1915. The time seemed to be at hand for a victory. The woman's handwriting was on the wall. But delay came now in a new form, the entrance of the United States into a world war. The nation bent itself to the single task of winning, and women pitched in. But feminist leaders used the war aims to further their own. They argued that since this was a war for democracy, it was unjust to exclude women from the democratic process. 2 years after the war, glorious victory at last. To get that word, male, out of the Constitution cost the women of this country 52 years of pauseless campaign. Thousands gave years of their lives. Hundreds of thousands gave constant interest. It was a continuous and seemingly endless chain of activity. For a long time after achieving the vote, there seemed to be no clear-cut feminist issue. But today, the women's movement is underway again, seeking to attain broader goals. Women are insisting upon full and general equality. They are demanding the opportunity to compete in any field on an equal basis with men. In place of the old, women are seeking a new self-image. The image is changing, but in a man's world, the models are still far too few. The unfinished work goes on against stubborn resistance to change. For the myth of female inferiority remains deeply ingrained in society. And only when this myth will have been shattered and the falsehoods laid to rest can the goal of true equality be won.